Alright guys, let's go ahead and hop in. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about morale. Now I've gone ahead and got myself a little bit of coffee. That's good stuff. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about morale. So the pain point that we're trying to sort of address with morale are those overly long D&D combats. We've all been there, the overbloated monsters with too many hit points, and you know, once we hit that point in the combat where we know that one side's either going to win or not, the momentum has shifted, we know who's going to come out on top, and now we're just sort of in the boring part on the back end of combat where we're basically sort of cutting through hit point. Players, they'll stop using leveled spells, they'll start to use like cantrips, you'll stop seeing them use like their valuable class abilities, which unfortunately also slows down the pace of combat, which is one of the reasons why that tail on D&D combat, that long, boring aspect of it, tends to be so long, and it drags down the game. Everybody's got too many hit points, and once it's clear who's coming out on top, whoever that is, whoever's got that momentum, they kind of stop using their valuable resources. They're trying to protect those so they can save those for other fights down the line, because they're pretty sure that they're going to win this fight. So the solution that I decided to sort of implement that really worked for me was to use morale. I want to talk a little bit about sort of like the history of morale, because morale's not a new thing for D&D. It is in fact an old thing for D&D, like a 50-year-old, like from the very beginning of the game, like it used to be a stat for creatures. So it comes from sort of the wargaming roots of D&D and was included in the original versions of D&D. We're talking about sort of a unit's morale for them and whether they're going to break and rout, basically, in a fight. And so when our founders were looking at that and they were translating what they knew from war games into sort of like individual creatures, morale made that transition. And where it kind of got dropped off was in that transition between 2nd edition and 3rd edition. When there was this sort of shift, the difference between 2nd edition and 3rd edition, that is when we see the shift. That's when TSR leaves, and then 3rd edition is Wizards of the Coast. And so you have this moment in there where the game passes hands to a different company, and they decide to put out a new edition of D&D. And this new edition of D&D has some new designs, has some new focuses. It has a bigger focus on sort of set-piece battles, and a more formal design doctrine about making balanced encounters. That's when we really start to see balanced encounters start to be language that people talk about both in the design of the game and as dungeon masters playing and running the games. The unintended consequence of seeing those morale rules move off to being sort of optional or non-existent because they're not as important, because combat should be perfectly balanced, is that DMs rarely have the monsters do anything but fight to the death. And that's when we start to see that super long tail on D&D combats, because this is a problem that really only happens in 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition of the game. It doesn't really happen in 0 edition. It doesn't really happen in Basic or Expert. It doesn't really happen in 2E. It's only once we see that transition to Wizards of the Coast where they have this focus on creating balanced encounters, and that tends to be the forward doctrine of it, where combats are set up more like team sports with one balanced team versus another balanced team, kind of going against each other in some sort of like sporting match, rather than the sort of wildly unbalanced nitty-gritty, like you need to choose your fights because fighting's usually really dangerous and will really kill you, and we run through characters a lot, which is the very early edition of sort of OSR sort of ideas of the game. So that's sort of the unintended consequence, is that then morale kind of deprecated, kind of dropped off because it wasn't important to the design doctrine. And so as HP sort of bloated with the additions, to make combats less deadly and more balanced, they became longer, they become more boring, and due to sort of this sunk cost fallacy of the time sink that is combat in modern D&D, contemporary like Wizards of the Coast D&D, combat becomes the most important and focused on aspect of the game. If you pop open a rulebook, especially a 5th edition rulebook, but certainly a 4th edition rulebook, and certainly I think 3rd edition and Pathfinder, you're going to see that 60% plus of those rules are focused on combat specifically. So if we look at sort of like each section of the game in the classic 3-pillar format, almost 2/3 of the game is covered by 1/3 of those pillars. And that's very easy to sort of look. If you flip any of the 5th edition books, whether that's 2014 or 2024, you actually start reading it and look at the table of contents, look at the pages, look what's on those pages. You notice that, like, there's just not a lot of support for exploration and social aspects of the game. Everything's very focused on that combat, and that makes sense when you think about in the average session. Assuming that you're having combats in the game, it's going to take up most of the game, especially like if you're running it straight out of the book and you're not doing any of your own sort of modifications, which is why I started implementing the things like morale, implementing things like random encounters, started implementing things like effort. I had to go outside and find other ways to strengthen these other areas of the game and retool combat to the combat aspect of the game to make it faster and more punchy and really reduce the slog on it, which is what we're doing with morale. It's just that the contemporary editions are a far cry from sort of the TSR editions of D&D, those early editions of D&D, where most combats could be run in minutes, and some combats are ended in one action in many cases. If anybody is familiar with OSR, is familiar with the power of the sleep spell, and what it can do, it can just hand wave a combat, especially of low hit die monsters. Be like, we could fight these kobolds, or I could just cast sleep. And we don't have to fight them, but certainly in the in the way that OSR games are played, we put them to sleep and then we cut their throats and then they're dead. But that is far different. And then if you look at something like the sleep spell in 5th edition and be like, oh, this spell is... yeah, it looks very much like the Gravity Falls meme. This is worthless. That's kind of the feeling. Not to mention the ridiculous number of monsters that are just immune to charm effects or sleep effects, so it makes it much less useful because the spell was so overpowered that they kind of they decided to knock it down, because they're trying, again, the function of what they're trying to do is to create this perfectly balanced encounter. That is what they're trying to do, that every encounter must be perfectly balanced. And so that way you can very much know exactly how many encounters to have in a day, and you know how those characters are going to use their character abilities and all that stuff, which I think we know that's very theory craft. I think anybody who runs the game and anybody who plays the game at the actual table knows that it doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. For me, morale, what morale really does is that a little self-preservation in combat goes a long ways. It really helps that combat from dragging once the tension about who's going to win the combat is gone. Because just as you as the DM can see who's going to win the game, the players get that feeling of who's going to win the encounter, like who's going to come out on top on the encounter. You know who's going to come out on top of the encounter. There's no reason your monsters can't grok that as well. If they realize that they're on the losing side, they're gonna not stick around just to die, assuming they have that sort of self-preservation instinct. Again, that's anything that's not mindless, or not serving a higher power, has a sense of duty beyond itself. So that basically means you're basically Xing out. Morale works on basically everything except undead, constructs, low-level elementals that are dumb, religious fanatics, and like parents protecting their young. That's about it. It pretty much works for every other type of creature, which is most of the creatures. Sure, they might serve some sort of big bad evil guy or overlord or whatever it is, but at some point we'll cross that threshold where they throw down their weapons and say, look, I'm not getting paid enough for this, and try to just remove themselves from the situation because they don't want to die. And the nice thing about morale is that it can work both ways. So let's say you're in an encounter where the player characters are kind of on the low end. So the momentum is definitely on the monster side. Things are going the monster's way. We've got some good die rolls. The players have made some blunders. They've had some bad die rolls. As we all know, players are really, really, really bad because of that balanced combat design. Players always go into a combat in contemporary D&D with the assumption that they can win this combat. And so it takes a lot of pressure. Often they do not make the decision until way too late to decide to leave combat, to flee combat themselves. And so one way that you can kind of protect them as a DM is to instead try to end the combat from the monster side. If they have the momentum, they have the characters outnumbered, maybe they've got that one or two player characters have been downed and they're making death saves, or one stunned or something like that. They've got more people. You can actually try to force them into some sort of parlay, into a negotiation, and be like, hey, you can grab that unconscious person, like unconscious PC, and like put a knife to their throat and be like, hey, surrender now or I'm going to kill your friend, or leave now or I'm going to kill your friend, and drop all your stuff. We're going to take your stuff. And now they have a decision to make. But it gives them an out that's not, hey, you're all just going to get TPK'd here. And as somebody who has had run plenty of their share of TPKs, I could tell you, players are really not very good at recognizing when they should run from combat. Even when they're told, you should run from this combat. So sometimes you gotta protect your players a little bit, because, of course, you have more information than they have. Because you know what's going on with the monsters in the dungeon and everything else. So it's a lot easier for you to step in and kind of help in that by trying to sort of force a parlay, by trying to force a surrender or force them to flee, rather than just keep attacking and attacking and attacking and attacking. Now, you might say, well, I'll just have the player characters make morale checks. Don't do that. Players do not appreciate that. I can't really force people to act in their own best interest. It's really difficult to do that. They're in control of their character. They get to they determine the actions, they make the decisions, they deal with their own consequences of their choices. You create the consequences. But it's sort of been my experience that about 3 rounds of combat feels about right. And like I said, this is sort of across different editions of D&D. About 3 rounds of combat feels right. Everybody gets a chance to get into the combat if they want to. Everybody has a chance to basically do something cool, to spend some sort of resources. Everybody's going to take usually a little bit of damage, or at least most of them are going to take a little bit of damage. And usually by the end of round 3, I feel like almost always I have an idea of which side has an upper hand in the combat and who's going to come out on top. Which is very different because you see, especially in those really, really long combats, you see things take like 6+ rounds, and then you're like, ah, well, we know we're going to win, so now we're not going to use those resources, which lengthens the combat. It's been my experience that by the end of like 3 full rounds of combat, everybody's going to go and do their stuff. Everybody's going to do something cool if they wanted to do something cool, or engage with the combat however they want to, or figure out what they were going to do. And it's usually pretty clear who's going to win the combat at that point. So now I'm looking for outs for the combat. Now I'm trying to resolve this combat and just, we're done with this. I'm trying to move on from this. So morale for me really helps. That's when my creatures, my DM controlled creatures, are diminished by a certain number in their group, or they lose a certain number of hit points where they're fighting that no longer makes sense for them to be in the fight. They're like, I think we're going to lose. I don't really want to die. By using morale, we're looking at combats that are a lot more snappy. They're often cutting the encounter times down by 50% or more for those, especially for those really long combats, especially once you start getting into higher levels and we really start to see that hit point bloat a lot. Especially when characters are like, I don't really want to use my high level spells, when it's very clear that I think we've got this combat in hand, but then they still have the hit point pool as if they are using those abilities. So we don't want to whittle down those bloated HP monsters who don't really pose a really serious threat after that. It's going to increase that verisimilitude or sort of realism that most creatures don't want to die. They act in their own self-interest. It's going to create a smoother transition out of combat usually. I like that a lot. Into other pillars of play, which means if you're down and there's 1 or 2 monsters left and they decide to run, and now your players are like, oh, we got to chase those guys down, or else they'll alert other people in the dungeon that we're here, and then that makes our life way more complicated. So now we're running after them, and now we can run into traps and hazards, and if we're just straight up chasing them because they know all the stuff that's in the dungeon, but the player characters don't know that stuff, that they're going to chase them down. It often ends into a chase scene, so you have combat that goes to chase scene that kind of goes directly into exploration phase. So it feels very it's got a very natural flow to it. And same thing happens if they decide to go into negotiations. If they decide to parlay or they want to do terms of surrender, or things of that nature, you have that same sort of feeling where it feels very natural, where it kind of goes from explicitly fighting to tense negotiation to resolution, and either the bad guys go away or you decide to take them as prisoners, hostages, whatever you want. And then you transition very naturally sort of back into the exploration phase of being like, all right, we're going places, we're looking at things, we're checking things out, we're plumbing the dungeon for more riches and loot and avoiding monsters and all that usual stuff. It gives a very... I find that it gives a very sort of natural flow to the game that isn't usually there. I think we all have sort of that instance that there is the game as it operates, and then there's combat, and that kind of functions in a totally different mini-game within the total game of D&D. That's when we start counting rounds and turns and all those things, and those are not something in contemporary D&D for sure that we don't really do when we're not in combat, or even jumping into combat. There are many times where PCs are walking along, let's say they're doing an overland thing. They're walking along, doing a hex crawl, they're walking along overland, boom, orc scouts. There's like 2 of them. Oh, we see them. Orc scouts take off. Players are like, oh, we're going to chase them down. Because we think they're going to lead us to... Maybe we're looking for orcs, and so we need to get more information from them or find out where their war camp is or whatever. So now we're chasing them. So we went from exploration to chasing. We catch up with them. We have the fight. We resolve it. We try to push them to surrender because we want to talk to them. Now we're going straight from fighting into negotiation, back into exploration as we travel to the war camp. It's got this very sort of natural cadence that makes sense rather than, okay, you see them, they run, okay, we're going to go into initiative and start doing things. The smoother that transition is between the different sort of tiers, the pillars of play, the more natural the game feels like, both to run and I think to play. As Todd Howard says, it just works. Right? It just makes sense. It just flows very nicely. The other nice thing it does is that adding morale adds a lot of interest to encounters. Now we have this sort of negotiation aspect where stopping enemies from alerting others, from running, from finding reinforcements, which will make our combats harder in the future, especially if they're going to try to set up ambushes and traps for us. It's going to force the player characters to manage prisoners and hostages. Are they going to try and turn some of these creatures to allies? Are they going to try to get information out of them? Are they just going to leave them to escape? Are they going to show clemency? They're just going to let them go? Are they going to make some sort of morally gray decision to like kill surrendering creatures? Is that going to cause some sort of alignment or reputation shift if they're known as sort of bloodthirsty adventurers who cut the throats of unarmed people who have surrendered to them? And, you know, what is that going to do for your paladins and your clerics and those sorts of people? Once they find out about that reputation, going to view them, how will they approach them? How will they feel about talking to them? How will they feel about being alone in the same room with these people? Right? It kind of changes how the game is played. Again, we can add morale to basically any combat with thinking creatures. It's especially useful, though, I think, for your BBEGs, your big bad evil guys, your villains, who are very good usually at prioritizing their own life, so they can always sort of like regroup and continue to be a pain in the party's butt. Especially if they get vindictive after the PCs like foil their plans. These villains can be really fun, especially if they come back to sort of like hunt down and hurt the PCs in different ways other than killing them. They hurt their friends and other NPCs they love. They do things like impact their finances, their wealth, mar their reputation. You know, they commit slander and defamation of character and all that fun stuff. They do those sorts of things as well. So that can make a reoccurring villain who, even when they're no longer like a physical combat threat, can still just be a pain in the butt, especially, and then the player characters have to focus on like tracking them down and dealing with them. It makes it just so much easier to build a villain that your players are going to love to hate. And these creatures can also be added to... I've talked about in other videos about sort of my session timers. If you want to look at sort of my resource die mechanic video, which you can check out the channel, sure, like and subscribe, check that stuff out. The resource die thing where we're sort of slowly ticking down session to session to when they're going to show up, and the players are going to have to deal with the consequences of their characters' actions. How did they treat these NPCs? Help them? They let them go? Were they especially cruel to them? And then those NPCs can show up at very specific moments when the pieces are off doing something completely different at this point. These are going to show up to help them, or maybe hinder their plans. Maybe they're allied with other bad guys that they're dealing with this time. Creates this web of interconnectedness, having this sort of inbuilt karma system that's based off of the morale, that works with the morale system as well, which is a lot of fun. So you see all these sort of systems are nested and kind of incestually sort of linked together, and they all work with each other. And that might make it sound like it's a sort of like Byzantine, cumbersome thing to sort of engineer. If it was that difficult, I wouldn't be doing it. It's very, very simple. So I'd say definitely go check out the resource die, and my 2d6 favorite tables dies video. Those are fun ones to kind of see how these little things just kind of like add a lot for not a lot of extra work. We kind of talked about everything about it, so how do we actually do morale? So basically I just roll a 1d20. This is what we used to call in the old days a roll under mechanic. It's the same thing that's used for things like Call of Cthulhu and other usually D100 games, where you have a certain stat and you're trying to roll under that. This is one of the reasons why scores are the way they are in D&D. When you see ability scores that usually go up to 20, this old vestigial thing that's hanging on from old D&D, which is the roll under mechanic. If you were going to say you wanted to try to lift something, rather than have a DC for it, let's say you had a 16 strength, you just roll a D20, and if you roll a 16 or under, then you succeed. Now obviously that doesn't work with contemporary D&D, which is why it's not part of the mechanics, because you could have barbarians that have above 20, you're always going to roll under. You can't fail. So that doesn't really work as a mechanic, which is why, especially in the old versions of D&D, it only ever went up to 18, and getting an 18 was exceptionally rare for an ability stat. I've done this a ton in the solo RPG, but let's say we're fighting a pack of wolves. Why not? Pack of wolves. I think wolves have like a charisma of 4, something like that. They've taken their damage. They've reached the point where they need to start making morale checks. Then pick up the d20 at the start of their turn. I roll it for each wolf. Did I roll a 4 or under? Then yeah, they stay in the fight. If I roll a 5+, they're gonna run. So it works really well, especially with like beasts who don't have sort of like that religious fervor or zeal. They generally don't have that sense of duty, except obviously they'll protect their own sort of pups and things like that. So that's when I will apply something like an advantage or disadvantage, or I'll change the point at which they start making those saves. But you can use advantage and disadvantage to alter the circumstances. Say if one of the PCs makes a successful intimidation check against let's say bandit. A sorcerer makes an intimidation check against the bandits that they're fighting and does really well. And I'm like, all right, well, they're going to start rolling morale checks, and they're going to roll at advantage, which is technically disadvantage. So I'm going to take the higher number. Bandits have like a 10 charisma, 10 or 11 charisma. So if I roll anything that's like 12 or above, yeah, they're out of here. So I'm going to roll 2 dice, take the higher number, and they're going to get out of here. So it's very simple. It gives you this, the advantage disadvantage mechanic can work into it to kind of give you this ability to customize it so it makes sense for the situation. It can be a bit wonky for new DMs. I do say that to get the sense that, hey, advantage and disadvantage is actually inverted here, and the roll under mechanic. So if you are new to the hobby, especially if like D&D is the only game you've ever played, these are technically mechanics that are from other editions of D&D and other games in general. So it can be a little wonky to wrap your head around, because you have to do things like flip advantage, disadvantage. That's one of the reasons that I tell people is like, you should try to play more games. You should read them, you should play them, you should try to run them, because the more games, the broader your perspective is, the more you're going to be able to bring into your games. Like, that's the only reason I need to bring in morale, because morale is an old thing of D&D. If I'd never played like an OSR clone or anything like that, or basic or anything of that nature, I wouldn't know about morale. I wouldn't know to bring morale into the conversation, how to easily implement it. Because yeah, that's exactly how morale works in old school D&D. Morale was just like a statistic for creatures. Just like strength, it's just a score. Just like strength or constitution or intelligence or wisdom, same sort of thing. They would just have a score, and you would roll against that score, and that would determine whether they were going to stay in combat or not. And like, oh, it's incredibly simple, and I don't have to make a new stat. I can just use their charisma stat, because that's kind of how charisma works. Kind of. It's like your mettle, your bravery, your courage, along with your presence and a whole bunch of other stuff, as well as your ability to sort of persuade people and natural magnetism. Charisma's a weird stat because it does a lot of weird different things, and it's incredibly unclear most of the time. But I do use charisma most of the time, or intelligence. I will fall back on intelligence if that makes more sense. It's not that difficult, but it does take a little getting used to if you're not familiar with sort of like the roll under mechanics, to remember that, hey, this uses a slightly different mechanic. So when do you start checking for morale? Usually I do it at the start of a creature's turn, assuming that it's hit one of the below conditions. That is, for most encounters, it's either 50% of the group is gone. So if you have a group of 4 and 2 of them are gone, the remaining 2 are going to start making morale checks no matter what their HP is at, or their individual HP is below 50%, at which point they're quite hurt and they're getting scared and they're going to try to leave. That's usually when they'll be like, I'm going to take disengaged action and move out of here. That's sort of my general guideline. Now, there are some times that I'll change it. So for veterans that have a lot more discipline, so if I wanted to do something like really want to, like it's Hobgoblin group that's got a Hobgoblin captain with them, I'm like, okay, well they need to be taken down to like 25% of their health remaining, or 25% of the group remaining, because they just have a higher discipline. They are hardened combat veterans. They know what they're doing, probably know what happens if they rout, that they're more likely to die if they do that. They have a lot more discipline, they're going to stay in the fight longer. You might have more skittish opponents. This might be good for just like random kobolds you come across, or goblins that you come across, where it's like 25% instead of 50%. It's like, oh, well, they take a quarter of their hit points and damage and they're ready to get out of here. They're not trying to die, they're kind of cowardly by nature. It feels very goblin, very kobold, very sort of small, skittish creature. There's a lot of that sort of like Ludo narrative, which is our $5 word, resonance. Like that makes sense. The mechanics make sense with what we're trying to portray in the narrative. Sometimes I'll use opportunists. That's basically once they've been hit with anything, any sort of status or damage. And give you some just basic examples. I think will probably help do it. So let's say you're traveling through the Underdark and there's a drow ambush. That's what I would consider just sort of like a basic thing. So 50% of the group is gone. They're either dead or fled. The individual drow has lost 50% of its HP. Now, it's important to remember that when we're talking about 50% reduction of a group, that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. One of them gets to the point where they're making morale checks and runs away, then we still count that as being reduced from the group number. So if we had 4 drow, let's say one of them's dead, one of them was really badly hurt and had to make a morale save and failed it and decided to run. Now those 2 that are remaining, their group is reduced by 50%. They're also going to start making morale checks. So you start to see this sort of cascade effect that like once somebody breaks and runs, it's more likely other people are going to start to break and run. That feels like how it should work in real life, right? It has that sort of realism, that verisimilitude, again, another $5 word, feels like it models kind of reality. People look at that and it doesn't sort of like raise an eyebrow. Like they're like, yeah, one person runs and then other people kind of lose their mettle for the fight and also start to run, and as more people run, the rest of them are more likely to run. So it makes sense. So we have a drow ambush, that's kind of a standard 50%. If I was going to say fervent kobolds that are protecting their worm, which is, so instead of like the part where they only lose 25%, now we're talking about they are specifically trying to protect their leader / god, because kobolds have a weird relationship with dragons. And now they're like, well, they're going to fight. These are like for your kobold dragon shields and things like that. They're a little bit more sturdy usually than just your average kobold. So they're going to do the same thing, just like I talked about with the hobgoblin veterans to begin with. They're going to go to probably 75% dead or fled or lost HP. Let's say a solo migrating, let's say a Rimmeraz, because I never get to use them. It's just moving along its way. It comes across the adventuring party out in the wilds or in the Arctic wastes, you know, traveling across the sort of like tundra, snowy tundra plain, and the Rimmeraz sees them and a fight starts. And the Rimmeraz is like, I lost 25% of my HP. There's nobody here but me. These are a little bit too difficult for me. I don't care about them that much. I'm gonna move on. And so it's gonna dive back below the snow and take off. You could have, let's say, like a hungry solo displacer beast. It's just being opportunistic. It's looking at these and it's like, looks at the wizard, I like that guy who's in robes and doesn't look like he has a lot of muscle and looks like he doesn't have any armor on. I bet he tastes real good. And so try to jump on the wizard and attack them and gobble them up. It's gonna turn into a combat, and as soon as people start attacking it and hitting it with what would we consider like serious hit point damage to it. It's like, yeah, all right, well, I'm not that hungry. We'll look for easier targets, show you what would look like on the other side. Zombie hordes, right? Zombies are undead, they're mindless, they're gonna keep fighting to the last hit point, right? The only thing on their mind is brains, and they want your brains. And so they're coming after you, and they're going to fight to the last hit point. If the party decides to run, like it's very sort of like Walking Dead, like there's a horde of them, they're going to try to follow you until they get distracted with something else. Now again, I don't think that zombies generally make a very good survival checks. But if they injure you, maybe one of you is like bleeding a little bit and they can follow a trail of blood. Actually, I might just give them advantage because there's a whole bunch of them, so they're aiding each other. But the idea is like, look, they're gonna keep following you, they're gonna keep attacking you until you deal with them or you're able to shake them somehow to show you the other side of it. So you have these creatures that are in the fights that are willing to break from the fight if it's not going their way, and then you have these creatures that are sort of mindless that have one thing that's on their mind. They're only doing this one thing. They're gonna fight to the last hit point every single time. And the only way you're gonna stop is by killing them or getting away from them. You yourself getting out of combat. You can try mixing morale with the alternative encounter goals. We covered that in sort of the upgrading combat video. One of the classic examples I always use is like a random goblin encounter while the party's trying to take a long rest. And that the goblins' motivation, their goal in the encounter, they're armed, but they really want the PC's like gear and wealth. They're likely to fight to, again, like that 25% level. But they're more focused on sort of evading attacks and running away with supplies than actually hurting PCs. So it kind of creates a totally different encounter because they have a very different goal. Their goal is to not kill PCs. Humanoids that are better fighters than them, they're just trying to take stuff. So they're just taking stuff and they're scattering and running in all different directions, and now the PCs are trying to like split themselves off and chase down individual goblins to try to grab their backpacks back or their magic items or, you know, coin purses or whatever they've stolen, food, etc. Let's talk about like some pitfalls to avoid. Like anything when it comes to being a dungeon master or game master trying to run a great game, it's as much like an art and gut feeling as science and mathematics. Sometimes it will just kind of feel right or wrong. For a creature to make morale check or even pass or fail it without a check, you don't need to have this sort of like slavish devotion to always rolling morale checks and always abiding by the dice. Remember, the dice are kind of there to serve us as a DM, and we can just determine when and why we're going to roll the dice. So if we go, there's only like one goblin left, technically should be making morale checks, but like it's one goblin versus 4 third level characters, he's just gonna run. I don't need to roll for that. He's just gonna run. He's not gonna stick around here. There's no point for him to stick around here. What would he accomplish by being here? Kind of go with your gut feeling. And if you don't know what the gut feeling is, if you don't have a strong read on something, that's when you can bring the dice in and be like, okay, well, I think it's about time to start making those checks to just kind of see what's going to happen. So that way you can be surprised with your group of players to be like, oh, I guess they're going to run. Time that we add these extra little things in the game, it's another sort of plate you have to keep spinning as a DM. It's another thing you got to remember. There is that aspect to it. So especially if you're a new DM or you're trying to implement this for the first few times, it's going to take a while before it kind of becomes second nature. That's fine. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it, don't worry about it. If you're feeling overwhelmed by like normal combat operations, just the normal combat stuff, don't sweat it. It's not that big of a deal. It's always going to be there. You can always implement it whenever you want to. You can always include it in your games when you feel comfortable managing everything else that's kind of going on. So it's not something that you have to worry about, like, if I don't do this, my games will be not as good. I feel like it made my games better, but it doesn't mean by not having it in your game that your game's gonna be bad. Those are not the same things. Don't try to spread yourself too thin as a DM. It takes practice to kind of get into these things. The solo RPG really, really helped me a lot with making sure I'm being very cognizant about morale, because I do it a lot. Even though I have a lot of stuff going, I have a lot of plates to spin in the solo RPG campaign when I'm running multiple characters and the bad guys, plus anything else that's kind of going on in the scene to try to remember morale. But for me, it becomes very easy to be like, okay, when it's the monster's turn, I immediately look at the monster's hit points and how many of them there are left. And I'm like, okay, this seems like the right time to start making morale checks for this monster. Kind of going with that gut feeling, because I've kind of nurtured that and developed it over time. So if you don't feel like you have that, that's fine. It's just going to take you a little little bit to get there. Don't beat yourself up about it, is what I'm trying to say. Another sort of pitfall, I think, is the style of game that you're running. So very much this works for my games and made my games better because I run a pretty gray kind of game where everybody's kind of bad, everybody's sometimes good. And so I think morale works best with a game that has that sort of style to it. Rather than, like, if you let them go, they're just going to go off to the next village and eat that village's babies, or they're going to find the nearest damsel to tie to their train tracks while they curl their mustache. Because that's what they do, because they're evil by nature. It just makes sure that everybody's on the same page of the type of game that you're running. We're having this encounter with Dwargar and the Underdark, and we've got 2 that we've sort of taken as prisoners at the end of this combat who have surrendered to us. Our characters know from, like, in the world, have an idea, and you can make an insight check if you want, you don't have to. Hey, if we let these 2 people go, what are they going to do? Do we have a feeling they're going to go get reinforcements and come back and this is going to bite us in the butt because they're going to go get reinforcements and we're just going to have to fight another combat all over again? Or do we think, like, when we release them, they're going to take that to heart and they are going to flee somewhere else and go do something else with the rest of their lives? So just kind of getting on the same page with that is really, really important. Just so everybody understands the type of game we're running and they understand the potential consequences, the boons and banes of the actions that they decide to take with the morale system. The same thing is like, hey, if you remember that you are a lawful good paladin, these creatures have surrendered to you. If you cut throats of an unarmed person who is surrendered themselves into your mercy, that feels like an alignment shift. That's a point on your paladin license. You might be losing your license, buddy. You're going to strain your connection with your higher power. Is that something you want to do? And now that kind of puts them in an interesting thing to make some interesting choices about, oh, what do I do? And anytime that you can put those sorts of important, meaningful choices in front of your players, you're doing a good job as DM or GM. Like, that is what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to put them in situations where they need to make meaningful choices and have to deal with the consequences, good and bad, of the outcomes of the choices. I do want to reiterate, it seems really inherent to me, but I know that I've been doing this for a while, so I'm going to explicitly state it because it's worth explicitly stating. Morale rolls are not for PCs. They are not for your players. They are for you as a dungeon master and your cadre of nasty monsters. They are not for the PCs. Your players are in charge of their own characters, their decisions, and their destinies. The players are not going to be happy if you force one or more of them to flee or surrender in combat. I think it's worth thinking about spells like Cause Fear, Calm Emotions, and most charm effects. Even those really powerful spells, they don't force any target actually out of combat. They might reduce their ability to do a lot of things in combat, but it doesn't actually explicitly make them stop fighting. So it's important to remember that even if powerful magic doesn't force creatures to flee or surrender in combat, then you probably shouldn't be doing that as some sort of homebrew mechanic. Something to keep in mind. See, I think that's pretty much it for morale. That's sort of the in-depth take on it. Hopefully you guys sort of enjoyed that. You got a lot out of it, and I hope you guys start to implement that in your games if you haven't already. Try it out. Tell me about your experience in the comments below. If you have any other things that you've tried, like morale, that you've added to your games that have made a big difference, share. Let other people know. I'm interested to learn all sorts of new things like that. I'm always looking for ways to sort of like tweak and improve my own games. So if you have stuff for me, make sure and let me know. I appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else will as well. If you want to support the channel, you can like and subscribe, of course. But most importantly, share the content. Share it on socials, Reddit, Ian World, or any other of your preferred RPG forums. You know, D&D Beyond or whatever it is. That way I don't have to sort of rely on the YouTube algorithm alone to sort of like people to find this content, because I think people find the content, they like it, so I want to make sure that more people get more eyes on it, because I think it's useful for other people and they seem to enjoy it. But that is everything for morale, and I will see you guys next time. Alright, bye.